We were spoilt for choice on the top boards of the British Championship yesterday in round 4, certainly in terms of finding a game of the day. First there was the slow burner between Nick Pert and Chris Ward, which eventually turned out to be a very interesting game, eventually drawn. Then there was the fiery encounter between Simon Williams and David Howe, where Simon went straight for David Howe's guts. Unfortunately came a cropper. And my game of the day for round 4, which is the excellent encounter between Glenn Flear and Mark Hebden. Now we know of course that Mark Hebden's played more against Keith Arkle than anybody else on the planet. And I'm certain that he would have played against Glenn Flear more often had Glenn been living in this country. Of course Glenn lives in Montpellier these days. But Flear and Hebden, they're two old rivals and friends from Leicester, and they normally produce the goods when it comes to entertaining chess. And so it was in this round. Well, Glenn was white and he kicked off with d4, and Black responded with his usual King's Indian defence. Most contemporary players mix and match in the opening, trying to avoid the dreaded computer preparation. But Mark Hebden remains faithful to his repertoire, especially with Black. After e4 he plays e5, and after d4 and associated flank openings he plays the King's Indian. So that's showing great confidence in the enormous amount of hard work he's basically spent over the years, turning openings like the King's Indian into a winning weapon for him. Well, now White has to make his choice, and Glenn decides to play the Averbach variation, which has actually served him very well in recent times. I recall the excellent game he played against Jonathan Hawkins in last year's British, which won him the best game prize. And Black responded with c6, which is a bit unusual, at least by comparison to c5 or knight a6, which are far more common moves. And White decides to play knight f3. Now this was an important moment in the opening, as White could clearly have preferred queen d2. That's a typical Averbach lineup for White. Or even f4. f4 must be a test of Black's opening line, because against the 4 pawns attack, c6 is often a passive move. But Glenn sticks with classical play. He puts his knight on f3, and after knight a6 he castles. I mean, we can't argue with this. This has been just one way to meet the Black system. Black attacks the bishop moves back. Black attacks the bishop one more time, and the bishop drops back to c1, which looks very odd to the untutored eye. But have the moves Black has been making been useful to him? I mean, that knight on g4 looks a bit exposed. The pawn on h6 likewise. Although Black seems to have made more moves than White, if those moves are useless, then, well, at least that's what White's hoping for. So Black strikes in the centre with e5. He's got to be energetic to try to sort of make use of these extra moves, and White decides to play h3. Now, if White's apprehensive about the capture on d4, which is coming, he may trade on e5. My own view is that such an exchange, and then of course play h3, slight twist in the move order. My own view is that exchanges like the one we're about to see don't really offer much to White. For instance, in the game Ponomaryov versus Grischuk, Beijing 2011, White played bishop a3, and after knight h5, Black essentially had a pretty comfortable King's Indian position. So going back to the game Flear versus Hebden, the move h3, if Black wants to mix things up, he's got to take on d4. White takes on d4 with the knight, and now we get a completely different type of game to the one we just saw, where yes, there's been a pawn exchange in the centre, but the position's much sharper. White's got a bind on Black's position, and Black's going to try and break that bind with energetic play. So anticipating an attack on the pawn at e4, White plays rook e1, Black plays rook e8, and now White plays bishop f3. Another weird looking move, you know, it looks as though the bishop is very poorly placed on f3, but Black's got a problem, I would say, with his pawn on d6. I mean, this is a definite issue. The backward pawn, weak on a half open file. Well, this is a very common scenario to all King's Indian players, and Black's got to hope that he can whip up enough initiative to compensate him for that pawn. Well, Hebden now plays a new move, knight to d7. previously seen were knight c5. This was the game Milov versus Tratar dos Hermanos 2003. And after that, white played bishop f4, which I think is a good move, and built up a very nice position after simple centralisation. He put his queen on d2, black protected the pawn, and now rook a d1. This is a very nice position for white, and similar to the position Flear gets in the game. Very interesting, though, is a move which hasn't been played that much, and that's knight h7 in this position. And the idea is that if white goes bishop e3, black goes knight g5. This could be a more productive use of the knight on f6 than even the idea that Hebden finds. As well, as we'll see in the game, he plays knight d7, white goes bishop e3, knight e5. It turns out that knight on e5 is a target for white's pawn on f2. So black continues with active moves, as he should do, but now f4, very good, and black is starting to go backwards, which is not really what he wants. The knight must go to the only square, d7, and now bishop f3 again. White's thinking about b4, so black plays a5, keeping the knight on c5, and now bishop f2, sending the queen back, after which Flear plays rook a d1. So this looks like a standard King's Indian position, but it's actually a pretty passive situation for black. I don't see how he can compensate for the weak pawn on d6. Hebden tries all he knows, but it doesn't turn out very well for him. Okay, so he first attacks the pawn on c4, which white defends. He keeps jabbing at the white queenside pawn structure. Again, white defends. Black takes on b3, opening up his rook. But now we see it's actually more difficult for black to take this position further. White's got no weaknesses. He's getting ready at some point to just assault that pawn on d6. And knight bd7 by Hebden doesn't really convince. Although black's hoping that by playing knight d7, b4 won't have much of an impact, the problem is that white now gets a really serious initiative. And black doesn't have the resources to meet this initiative satisfactorily. So Hebden plays c5, and white played knight to c2, and now we reach a critical position in the game. Now we thought in the commentary room, and I'm sure this was Mark's intention, that his original idea was queen f6, putting pressure on f4. But this fails to the cruncher e5. And that's a very easy move to overlook. I'm sure Glenn Flear saw this during the game. Well, after this move, I don't think black can avoid a bad position. Let's look at the lines. If black takes on f4, then we go rook e4. The problem for this position for black is that his queen is a target, and white can chase this queen all around the board, and after that take on d6 with a massive position. So going back to queen f6, there is also, after e5, d takes e5. But once again, the queen becomes a target after knight e4. If queen takes f4, bishop g3 and bishop g4 wins the queen, so he's got to go backwards. And now I think the simplest way is just to take on b4 and go knight d6. Again, with the computer showing a big advantage to white here. Finally, after queen f6, e5, black can try queen f5 here, but then once again the queen becomes a source of difficulty, a problem for black after takes on b4, and knight to d5, threatening knight c7, and if rook a3, all the tactics are working in white's favour. Rook takes f3, and now the excellent move e takes d6. And black can't repair the defects in his position, despite at the moment his extra piece. So going back to the game Flear-Hebden, with Hebden unable to play knight queen f6, he's got to reluctantly play knight takes c2, and then Glenn moves in with knight d5. A very nice Zwischenzug, forcing a concession, and Hebden has to go backwards. Only now does white take on c2. So summing up, we can definitely say that white's advantage is increasing. The pawn on d6 now looks very weak, and black has terrible problems getting his queenside pieces into the game. He tried knight b6, white went e5, opening up the game, and black played his bishop to f5. Could he try, in this position, d takes e5? Well, then comes bishop takes c5. And if takes on d5, bishop f5, queen f2, once again, black is in serious difficulty. So going back to the game one more time, the bishop went to f5, the queen moved. Mark took on e5, white took on c5, so it's quite similar to the variation we just looked at. And now I think the most critical moment to date, as Hebden plays the mistaken move, queen to c7. I think if black wants to try and stay on the board here, he's got to try the move Glenn mentioned after the game to me, queen to c8, which is still better for white, but nowhere near as crushing as the game. Probably then, white would play a move like bishop f2, black plays bishop e6 with c5 coming up, and white takes on e5. Again, with much the better game, but it's not as bad as what happens, as you'll see, because after this, Glenn plays almost flawless chess to the end, starting with a tactical move, bishop d6. Queen to a5 was played. Of course, black can't take on d6 because of bishop f7 check, winning the queen. So queen a5, and now pawn takes e5. That's the simplest move. Black has got a severe weakness on f7 to guard. He tries bishop e6. Again, Glenn keeps it simple, in a good position. He takes on e6, and now c5. Rook e8, and now rook f1. And this is the issue. White is zeroing down on that pawn at f7. Of course, this stops black from taking on e5. Queen to d8 was answered by queen to f3, piling in. Black defends, white attacks. Events take a forcing course. Black must take, white recaptures. Black must give the check in order to keep protecting f7. King goes to h1. And now another key move, f5. Not a move Mark wants to make, but he can't see any other way to defend f7, given that c7 is coming up, irrespective, and that cuts the black queen off from defending the king. So the rest of the game was pretty horrible for black. He took on e5, white took, black recaptured. Queen c6 is very strong here, but Glenn preferred queen b3 check. And finally, rook to d7. And that's the move that is the finisher. After queen a6, the simple rook g1 sufficed to force resignation. Obviously, white could play rook c1 as well and give black the luxury of a check. No big deal. White takes, black takes, king h2. The game's finished now. That would have been another way to win. So you don't often see Mark Hebden beaten in his favourite King's Indian like that. This tells you that this was an excellent game by Glenn Flear and a very worthy game of the day.